So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled Mud, Blood, and Ghosts, Populism, Eugenics, and Spiritualism in the American West. Thank you for joining us for this Book Club of California presentation. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar tonight. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California and the history of the West, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, and the benefits are many. And frankly, we can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled Mud, Blood, and Ghosts, Populism, Eugenics, and Spiritualism in the American West. Our presenter is Julie Carr, author and professor of English at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Now, Julie Carr is also the author of 11 books of poetry and prose. Her poems and essays have appeared in journals such as The Nation, Boston Review, New American Writing, and many, many others. Her previous books of poetry and prose include Climate, co-written with Lisa Olstein, Real Life, an Installation, Someone Shot My Book, Objects from a Borrowed Confession, 100 Notes on Violence, Rag, and Think Tank. Underscore, a new book of poetry, is forthcoming in 2024 from Omnidawn Books. Now, her work has appeared in several anthologies as well, including The Best American Poetry from Scribner, Postmodern American Poetry, a Norton anthology, Lit from Inside, 40 Years of Poetry from Alice James Books, and many, many others. And she has been honored with the Sawtooth Poetry Award, named a National Poetry Series selection, and has received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. With Tim Roberts, she helps run Counterpath, an independent literary press and a bookstore / gallery / performance space / community garden in Denver. And as I mentioned, she is a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder in the Department of English, where she teaches courses in poetry and poetics from the 18th century to the present. Mud, Blood, and Ghosts is her first book of narrative history and the subject of tonight's presentation. Now, the book is both a biography and a general history of the U.S. West from the mid-19th century to the Depression. The presentation tonight will include the author reading from the book and a screening of a short film by Carolina Ebeid that utilizes archival images that are used in the book. Now, the talk will focus on the ties between the American eugenics movement, American populism, and the American West, as Julie shares the story of her great-grandfather, Omer Madison Kem, a Nebraska settler, a founding member of the Populist Party, a 3-term congressman, a practicing spiritualist, and an avid eugenicist. Now, in terms of logistics, tonight's program will include this presentation and then a Q&A session. If you have questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We should have some time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A and the chat. Okay, enough of me. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Julie Carr.
Well, hello. Thank you so much, Kevin, and thanks to the Book Club of California for having me. It's an honor to be here. And thanks to everyone who's showing up from wherever you're showing up from. I'm happy that you're here to give some attention to this book and film tonight. I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up of how this is going to go and a little bit about the book before I start. So as Kevin said, this is a narrative history and it does talk about populism, eugenics, and spiritualism from about 1870 to about 1930 with a quick dip back to 1850. But what I'm going to read is a kind of mashup of the book. So you're going to get a sense of that trajectory and those topics, but there'll be some significant leaps and jumps so that that sort of narrative through line of the book will be, maybe not completely clear. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards about that history or about sort of the story, the through line of that story. But it was important for me to also have a chance to show you the method in which the book is written, which is that while it is this narrative, it's also, there are also frequent jumps forward into the here and the now. And the here and the now is the here and now of me, of my research, my process, my writing. So you'll hear that, but also the here and the now of our current political climate in the US. So those jumps are happening as well across time. And then there's another element to the writing, which is a kind of poetic approach, both a poetic approach to narrative, which means that it is a kind of broken or jumpy or leapy kind of narrative, but also a poetic approach to language, which you'll hear at certain moments. The other thing I wanted to mention about the video, so the video, is, as Kevin said, is by Carolina Ebeid. There is original music in the video by Ben Roberts, and I will be reading over that music. And at a certain point, about 5 minutes into the video, I'm going to pause the video, but I'm going to keep speaking and that's when I'm going to go a little bit more deeply into the history. So when that video is stilled, I just didn't want you to think that it's malfunctioning or there's something wrong with your computer. It'll just be stilled, and then after a little while I'll press play and the video will continue as I finish the reading. So this is much more of a reading than a talk, so that is also important for you to know. And I think this will last about 35 minutes. So with that, I will share and begin. An archive survives to be revived. The archive as a limit, a thing in a box, is always also an opening. It opens on losses sustained, harms inflicted, the tenacity of survival, and on the persistence of lineages both proud and shameful. The archive, like the poet Paul Celan said of the poem, is lonely. This loneliness compels it, like a ghost, toward another, toward its reader. It is lonely and en route. It intends another, needs this other. To answer this intention by beginning to read, however haltingly and imperfectly, however quietly and slowly, is also to be en route, preparing for a present time worth waiting for, even if we do not live to see it. But what is it to approach an archive, to unlock the cabinet, lift the top off the box to begin to read? It is to invite a haunting, which nevertheless begins long before we open any books. And to invite the ghosts into the open, one must be ready to hear what they teach. No doubt, in 2016, when I first approached my great-grandfather's archive, I did not know what ghosts I was about to reckon with. My great-grandfather Omer Madison Kem began his adult life at the age of 16 as a hand-to-mouth tenant farmer in the swamps of Indiana. In 1881, married with 3 children and facing all-out destitution, he took advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862 and moved his family to Custer County, Nebraska. Like thousands of others, Kem was granted 320 acres to farm, a nearly impossible task given railroad rates, falling crop values, relentless drought, and a powerful lending industry preying on vulnerable farmers. He sold half this claim within the first year and mortgaged the rest. Further poverty and debt pushed Kem toward politics, as he became a founding member of the original Populist Party. Elected to the 52nd to 54th Congresses, 1891 to 97, Kem, like progressives and populists today, was an outspoken critic of capitalist greed and income inequality. He also became an avid spiritualist, visited by the ghosts of his mother, sister, son, and baby daughter Marie, and receiving guidance from the long-dead radical Republicans, including Abraham Lincoln himself. In 1898, Kem moved his family to Colorado, where he built a ranch house that would, in what he thought was a sign of a curse, burn down. Then he raised cattle and fruit and developed a decades-long relationship with an invented Indian spirit he named Fleetwind. Kem believed that Fleetwind visited him throughout the rest of his life to heal his ailing body and those of his loved ones. A decade later, he moved to Oregon, where he owned a power company, and there, and for the remaining 3 decades of his life, he became nearly obsessed with the dangers of blood mixing, with the promise and the problem of genetics. Over and over, in letters to family, friends, and newspapers, Kem promoted a eugenic program aimed at first defining and then weeding out an ever-increasing list of subhuman types: the idiot, the imbecile, the feeble-minded, the moron, the criminal, and even the poor. Considering the great white race to be vulnerable, in need of vigilant protections, he imagined purifying the race of all who could be deemed morally degenerate, anyone, in the end, who was criminalized or pathologized by the state. At once a biography and a narrative history of populist and progressive era politics in the West, this book is also a meditation on the present, a sort of memoir. For as I moved through these stories and tried to address the complex entanglements of violence, power, and resistance running through and around them, I didn't leave myself out. In fact, it would have been impossible to do so, impossible to act as if my kin were not running through my body and my home, as if their remains were not in full sight. Mud. By the time of Omer's passage through his mother's body, his mother Melinda had already lost most of her teeth, and Madison, his father, had not done well. Madison was at times a farmer and at other moments a laborer, paid sometimes in firewood, and when not paid, shivering with his family of 10 in whatever rented or borrowed home they then shared. In the tales Omer tells of his childhood, the family is frequently on the move, looking around the state and sometimes across its borders for something that could be profitable or at least livable. In one journey, the Kems head toward the bank of the Eel River, where they hope to farm. Along the way, they come upon a settlement forming around a canal digging project, and they take a gamble. Madison purchases a bit of land, expecting to sell it quickly, make a profit, and move on. The canal project fails, the area goes bust, and the family comes down with dysentery, which kills Mary Esther, just 8 years old. The others survive, though not without tooth rot. Calomel, a laxative, also known as mercury chloride, was given to treat digestive ailments and could cause both hair and teeth to fall out. In the case of Mary Esther, it also ate a hole right through her cheek. One can begin a history anywhere, in any year, at any moment. Let me fall back now into a year in which to start again, a year selected for its laws. For these laws have everything to do with the Indiana that Omer Kem was born to labor in, have much to do with why he, like other poor whites, eventually had to leave. 1850. 10 days after passing the Fugitive Slave Act and the Great Compromise, which criminalized the protection of fugitives from slavery, even in free states, this same body of lawmakers passed the much less well-known Swamp Lands Act. The law granted all wetlands to their respective states, directing states to sell the lands cheap to those willing to drain them for development. Prior to the Swamp Lands Act, nearly all Northwest Ohio and much of Indiana lay underwater and was not privately owned. Now this public wetland, held in common, would be rapidly privatized. Poor, unpropertied people had been able to make a living by hunting, fishing, and harvesting in that commons. Now, no longer, for the land was sold mostly to the wealthy speculators who could afford to develop it large scale. The Swamp Lands Act applied to all states with overflowed lands, but the swampiest states were still in the South. In a sense, then, the Swamp Lands Act can be read as an addendum of the Great Compromise, since the law would boost the slave economy by expanding the areas available for plantation farming. The act could benefit slavers in another way as well. To drain the swamp was to expose and destroy crucial sites of refuge, not only for poor whites, but also for fugitive slaves or maroons. Land deemed worthless to some had often meant survival for others. How might one ever narrate the histories of swampland marronage or fugitivity in Indiana, where much of the historical record now lies firmly buried under the paved parking lots and housing developments that stand where these swamps once were? One could invent it, but imaginative invention from my standpoint would only feel obscene, unless to invent is return to its humbler origins, invenire, to come upon. So I went to Indiana to feel what I could of the wetlands that remained. In the Loblolly Marsh, where in the early spring one can lie down in the tall grasses and not get wet, I recorded the sound of the wind and the peepers in the ponds, and I watched some blue shirts billow on a clothesline across the property line. How the law got some bodies moving and other bodies killed. How the law made property for some out of the land that had once protected those who were property or had none, and how the map I carried in my phone marked the path of capital's flow, but not the pathways used for flight. These things did and did not sound through the recordings that I made. From age 17 to 26, Omer Kem unsuccessfully attempted farming on 6 different swampy sites owned by wealthy developers. Because of the crop lien system, in which the farmer owes the landowner the crops before they even come in, and because on a swampy land they very rarely do come in, Kem and his family of 5 came very close to starving. Just as the history of wetlands remains as residue in Indiana's current social, economic, and ecological life, the residue of mud, a commons, a shelter, and finally a site of impossible and exploited labor clung to Omer Kem's life, even as he tried to leave it behind. Mud, as transporter of illness, as trans material, as temporary home for those in motion, as indicator of all that is not yet, has not yet arrived, not yet been made to produce, could only present a threat to those who sought to stabilize white ownership of land. The swamp was a borderland haunted by imaginary creatures and real-life exiles. Mistrusted but desired, it presented a potential site of both illness and sustenance, of future wealth and also of death. These associations ran deep in the Euro-American imagination. In Europe alone, there are at least 40 different names for creatures who live half hidden in a semi-fluid world. Nixie, Knucker, Necker, Kelpie, Brookhorse, Siren, Water Sprite, Rhine Maiden, Lorelei, Naiad. Half in, half out, these beings, often part animal, slit ears, fish tails, horse's hair, and almost always female, want to pull you, too, into the undefined and unknowable space that they control. When Omer Kem left Indiana, most of the lands bought up for draining were not yet dry. But within 50 years, the state had drained 97% of its pre-settlement swamps. Now, where one massive swamp and site of refuge once was, a poor neighborhood is being rapidly gentrified. On one peeling garage door, someone has painted a cluster of hot air balloons drifting away. Law and order, the populists in the House. Populism grew out of the Plain States and the South, where poor farmers, both black and white, came together in mutual outrage against a system set to exploit them. In the early 1890s, populists took over state houses, school boards, and mayor's offices in Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota especially, while also winning seats in the U.S. Senate and House. It was the most successful third party in U.S. political history. We begin with a body, a legislative body, a national body, a body in a house. Like all bodies, this body has boundaries, skin. It also has holes, just as the house has doors and windows. And just as doors and windows can be broken, the body itself is vulnerable. It is, after all, alive. There is illness, pain, incapacity, rupture, or simply there is more. Law's job, law's science, is to mark and underscore the boundaries around this body, to repair where there is fissure, to remove excess, to sew the body shut again. Inside the house's chambers, the law's tools, the law's method, is language, while on the streets, the law's tools are batons, tasers, guns, and cuffs. The law as boundary cannot help but be armed. To those who transgress it, it replies with absolute menace. All vigilant efforts to protect a body from invasion will tend toward violence, one way or another. In other words, language has a violence of its own. I went to the Congressional Library to read what Omer and the other populists had to say on that House floor. There, the words were heavy, dusty, and I was embarrassed to be asking for them. The librarian seemed reluctant, but he called down and told someone on the line what I wanted. I sat at a little desk and waited, like a child, waiting for her lunch. When the librarians arrived with their cart full of books, I was embarrassed all over again. The volumes were so massive, and there were so many of them. They knew, and I knew, that I wasn't going to actually read them. I was playing at being a historian, a scholar. A real historian would be online, using the search function. Or a real historian wouldn't need these books. They would already know what was inside. But weight, heft, dust, this impossible glut of language is the point. Online, the words are only light. They come and go in an instant. They hardly seem to be there at all. Here, the labor and the time it took to produce this torrent was palpable. Only an unremitting force of language, roll call, petition, debate, objection, joke, bill, vote, can make a body whole, where wholeness means lessness, a repair by way of exclusion, an anorexic logic. The law's game is border control. But Omer Kem and his cohort of dirt farmers saw themselves as other than this border law. They were a counter-political force waged against a system of exclusion. They'd called for a forfeiture of railroad land grants, voted for an 8-hour work law, demanded the nationalization of transportation, irrigation, and finance. They advocated for direct election of U.S. senators and safeguards against land speculation so that, quote, men of very meager means could have the privilege of making for themselves and their families a home. And in 1894, while the country faced a devastating depression, the populists argued for a graduated income tax so that the rich would be compelled to support the needs of the poor and the vulnerable. Those who were born poor and laboring in the earth to drain it, to extract from it, those who were forcing out of the earth or the factory the products that would make capital flow. Kem saw these people as other than the law. They were the ones who had had to beg. I repeat, we have begged you for years for relief, but you would not. And having sown the wind, you must now reap the whirlwind, he wrote. Rural, white, and indebted, they entered the house as a destructive force meant to break those walls that had been closed against them. They got in. But once inside, it was not just that they failed, stuck as they were in their populist corner. It was also that they succeeded too well. Having arrived as the unhoused, they were absorbed into the house, fused in a fusion politics of democratic, Christian, white supremacy. For in 1896, the populists gave up their party and endorsed Democrat William Jennings Bryan for president and Southern populist Tom Watson for VP. Watson had once been a powerful advocate for interracial solidarity, but later he, like many white populists at the end of the decade, embraced full-blown and entirely explicit white supremacy. In the decision to endorse the Democrat Bryan, the white populists signaled their abandonment of their black populist colleagues from the South, of which there were many. For of course, the Democrats were at that very time deliberately destroying all hopes for racial justice, violently turning Reconstruction into what they called redemption. Bryan himself would later be lauded and honored by the Ku Klux Klan as a man who has always championed the cause of righteousness. The collapse of interracial populism is the failure of the Populist Party. As historian Stephen Kantrowitz writes, a true interracial alliance required white men to surrender their own monopoly on power. And to be clear, there has not even yet been much evidence of that. Ghosts. Tables tip and tables walk. Chairs shift with no one in them. Doors swing open and will not stay shut. The curtain moves, spreads apart. A pillow flies through the air. The mattress is folded in half, the chair upon the bed. When the body of the other stops playing with the furniture, it enters your body instead, moves through you, through your hands. The ghost speaks thoughts that are not your thoughts. The ghost is a body you did not see. The boy was curled on the bathroom floor. A ghost or a vision, an unseen seen thing, a being made only of air. This child did not speak, but lay between the toilet and the bathtub, dressed in green shorts, a white shirt. In an earlier year, I'd heard my name spoken from a room I wasn't in, though I was the only person at home. Even earlier than that, I dreamed a man in a raincoat arriving at my grandmother Kathleen's door. She opens it for him, and then, as if struck, she falls. The next day, my father tells me that the man at the door was a neighbor. He'd come to talk about her car, which he was hoping to buy. It was raining in Salinas, California that day, and when she fell, the man in the raincoat was there to catch her. Does dreaming one's grandmother's life constitute a haunting? We used to sleep together in her bed, her teeth in a glass beside us. She was the first to tell me about the seances her parents held in their dining room, how she and her brother Victor would spy through the window at Omer, Alice, and their friends, who were sitting, eyes closed, waiting for the spirits to write their messages in the precise purple of the asters in their vase. All words are ghosts, writes K.T. Thompson, since they stand in for things not there. Are all stories ghost stories then? If we invent these spirits that nonetheless alter our lives in large and minor ways, why do we invent them? What is it we want from our ghosts? And what do they want from us? In his first year of Congress, Omer Kem had admitted to his settler guilt. Every time we have had an Indian war or an Indian depredation, the white man has been the aggressor, he said in a speech on the House floor. We have taken possession of the land of the Indian. We have dispossessed him of his home. But rather than attempting to redress this injustice or to heal this wound, he imagined the spirit of an Indian healer named Fleetwind entering and moving through his own body to heal him and his loved ones of whatever illnesses befell them. White spiritualists often spoke in the voices of racial others. Such Indian spirit controls, as they were called, were common then. In this blatant act of projection and appropriation lies the settler's guilty desire for forgiveness. But it's more than that. Populism arose out of a condition in which the settler farmer was deeply insecure in his relation to the land, which was nonetheless the foundation of his American identity and his survival. Native people, as Omer knew very well, had a legitimate claim to that land which no settler could ever duplicate. Playing Indian, then, was one way to get closer. But if the Indian within became a proxy for legitimate belonging and a sign of the desire for forgiveness, it also provided the white medium another opportunity for power and control. Desire for boundary crossing, for contact zones between bodies and spirits from diverse worlds can take many forms and can show up in all sorts of arenas, political, racial, sexual, and so on. For this reason, it's not hard to see why populism and spiritualism went hand in hand. Both movements challenged these boundaries, even if in challenging them, they also sometimes reinforced them. Spiritualism is a manifestation of the aspirational desire to enter and to be entered, to dissolve the rigidity of the individualized body, to find some way toward a deeper communion with others. Witnessing furniture moving on its own, opening their mouths to the voices from elsewhere. What the spiritualist refused was the border between the living and the dead, first of all, but also between categories of people, even between things and beings. The taste of this refusal is addictive and sweet and lingers still. What private, perverse, or political cravings for border crossings of all kinds do we still look to ghosts, the plasmatic, oral, luminous, or merely energetic non-matter, to gratify? There's a beauty to these cravings, but there's a violence there too, for the yearning for a dissolve of social and personal boundaries can look a lot like the settlers' claim to the land. Appropriative, aggressive, unjustified, and uninvited. And as such, haunting is like populism, a terrible demand and a radical invitation at once, a violent and utopian vision. I didn't fully enter the eugenic dreams of my great-grandfather until my third visit to the archive in the summer of 2017. Bia accompanied me to Omaha, where the then still undigitized archives were housed. She would explore the city, take pictures, while I stayed behind in the reading room, where the abhorrent language of fit and unfit, of race purity and contamination and race suicide rose up from Omer's hand-typed lines. The circle between my father's ancestors and my mother's was tightening, I thought, for my mother was Jewish. Far-flung members of her family had been murdered for the eugenic cause called Nazism, an irony that begged further study. But that day, I could read very little. Feeling dizzy and nauseous, I put my head down on the desk, waiting for Bia. When she finally returned with her camera roll, I said, "Let's go. Let's find something to do." Bia and I left the library that summer night in Omaha to drive around without purpose. I kept quiet, thinking about the project of race purity that, as much as any dream of populist egalitarianism, was my inheritance. And then, up on a grassy hill, there was a party. In the non-worded language of the dance, under evening clouds amassing and dispersing to a different rhythm, I felt we had found a future. I got caught in the grassy scent, a man's wrist floating from his seat on the lawn, a girl's ponytail swaying in syncopation with the beat. For us to arrive there, in that dance, it seemed we had had to leave the reading room behind. The words had told one story, but the dance told another. Through the blood in motion, the blood that is not other than the breath that is not other than the air that is not other than another's air, another's blood, we were not pure. Like the mud that clung to Omer's memory and made him anxious, then made him rage, we were unsettled. The desire to locate some essential beingness, some essential selfhood or nationhood in the blood was a hysterical response to the always compromised relation between the colonizer and the land he staked his claim on. But the blood is not the metaphor they hoped it was. The blood does not speak of difference and distinction, of purity and separation. The blood speaks only the language of contamination, which at its root means to come into contact, to commingle. When I asked my father for memories of his grandfather, he told me of lying in the grass in Omer's backyard, gazing up into the branches of a tree. Omer is not in this memory, but he is. My memories of my father also include lying down on the earth, I am maybe 10. We are on our backs, holding hands, feeling the world spin, watching the leaves shift and flutter. I can still smell the scents of soil and grass. I can still feel his hand, which holds me in place as I fall. Omer is also in this memory. So is Iris, Huxley, Victor, Alice, Mary, and Kathleen, whose life I saw in my dreams. So too are the people whose lives their lives intersected with, those they disregarded and harmed, and those they loved and tried to protect. History dissipates through the air, enters our bodies, and makes us who and what we are. But we might not see it unless we see how it makes things move, might not feel it except in moments of great duress or quietness when we sense ourselves to be breathing. 5 years into writing this book, I learned what it was from a dream. I was walking toward a group of young people, maybe my children, maybe other people's children. I was holding something small and hard in my hand, like a stone. "It's my manuscript," I said. I was looking for a safe place to put it. But they laughed at me. "Don't you know, you don't need that thing anymore," they said. "It's in your whole body now." And that is it. Thank you so much for sticking around for that reading.
I'm back.
Hi,
And
Kevin.
hi. Um, and you said this word a couple of times during your talk, and it's kind of the way I feel right now. Unsettled is a word
Mm,
that you've used a couple of times. Watching and hearing your story and the narrative, it's a lot to take in and and to process. I wasn't expecting to get so engaged and focused on the story like that. So
Thank you.
that was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your family, your history, and your words. You're such a poet. There's so much poetry in your presentation and in the book. So thank you
You're
for
welcome.
sharing
Thank you.
that. Someone just wrote beautiful recitation in
Mm.
the chat. I'll share all the chat comments with you after this. But now's the time, if you're still with us, if you want to use the chat or the Q&A to make a comment or ask a question, please go there and do that now. I have a couple of questions myself, and I think I'll just start with that. Oh, I did put in the chat how to buy the book. If people are interested, I'll put it up there again if you missed it. But if you scroll back in the chat, you'll see it. But when I get a break, I will put that back in there.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with you're a poet. You've written so much poetry, but I think now you do need to call yourself a historian.
Ah.
You said you don't think you're a historian, but I think you are.
Mm,
You've done kind of that research. At least this book is a lot about your family history. There's a lot of
mhm,
history there, and I guess my first question is, how did that take shape for this book, since you've
mm,
written so much poetry? How did you
mhm.
then go, you know what, I have a story to tell. There's a history and a narrative here that I want to put out there. Can
Yeah,
you tell us a little bit about that?
sure. Yeah, I mean, the idea for writing this really comes out of the archive itself. So Omer had written, was himself an incredible writer and wrote a ton. And
Mm.
sort of the last few decades of his life, he was working on an autobiography, which is 11 volumes that are because of basically because he was a congressman, ended up getting housed in a library, as I write about in Nebraska. And we as a family, we knew about that. There was a kind of condensed version of the autobiography that had circulated in the family that we had. So we knew that that existed and that it was there, but I don't think anybody had gone to try to read it. So that, having that wealth of language and that kind of, and having access to it meant that, I just felt that, I guess, as a writer, one feels one should write. So I think I felt just compelled to do something with it, but I didn't know exactly what that would be. But then when the sort of confluence of events was 2016 was the summer of the beginning of the election. So the nomination of Trump, and that made the word populism circulating quite a bit in our culture. And so suddenly there was this concept of the populist, and it seemed to mean something that was different than what I had always sort of been told a populist was, based on on Omer's story. So I was very curious to understand more about that, and try to make sense of who were these early populists, and sort of what do they have to do with populism now. But then also that same summer, it was, if people know about this or remember, it was the summer of Standing Rock. So the water protectors up at Standing Rock and their very many months long protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that event was very significant for the West, and it was significant for the world, but it was significant for the West in particular, and definitely had a big effect on how I was thinking, and many of us were thinking about our own relationship to land, and in particular in this case this sort of settler history of my family. So those were the three, kind of the archive being there, and then these two big sort of political events got me going. And why it ended up being a book like this instead of a book of poetry, I mean, I think I just knew there was too much to learn, and too much to tell. I mean, there's a way in which, somebody was saying the other day about the difference between prose and poetry is well, I can't remember what they said about poetry, to be honest, but what they said about prose was it's prose when you think to yourself, I have to tell the whole story, right? Because poetry is not really, sometimes it is very narrative. And of course we have epic poetry that is all about telling the whole story. But, in the sort of contemporary lyric mode, it's really not about telling the whole story. It's really about the sort of the indicating and the condensing and the gesturing. And sometimes, can be quite abstract and interested in all kinds of ideas. But the telling of the whole story really seems to demand prose, even though you never tell the whole story. So those were the things that really kind of made me want to do this, and it did feel kind of bold, and it felt like a little bit of an invasion of other people's discipline to try to write this historical thing. But I had a lot of support from historians. So right away I was talking to my colleagues who are historians, and they were, well, in particular, Thomas Andrews, shout out, was incredibly supportive and kind. And so I just got a lot of guidance and support. And then as the book went on, I was reaching out to historians all the time by email, just like random emails, and people were just so generous with their knowledge, and their expertise. It was kind of stunning.
It's pretty amazing that this archive existed, for you to have access to. And then also still family members, because you said you talked to your grandfather about like some of his memories, if he had any memories. So that's pretty amazing that you had those sources. Your father, because it was his grandfather.
It was his grandfather, yes.
Right. So you had kind of different sources to pull from, and pulling this together. What kind of launched you into this in the first place, right? Because you've known about the family history, or it's always been there, and then the populism thing. But is that really the linchpin that said, I need to go see the archive? Or
I think, I think it really was, but I think what you're really asking is kind of like, what made me so desirous to go into history? And I think it was really to be honest, it really was the Trump election. And I think that there was a kind of shockwave that went through the country with that. We're in a very different place now, and I think people are maybe more jaded or more used to it. There's other concerns. I mean, it's a different time. Time moves very quickly in our world. But I think in 2016, there really was a sense among a lot of people that that things were very different suddenly. That he could actually get elected, and with everything that he did and said. And so I think I'm not alone in this. I think a lot of people were like, okay, there's something we don't know. There's something that we miss. There's something we don't understand. I mean, there were people who didn't feel that way, but there were a lot of people who did feel that way, and I was definitely one of them. And so that sense of like, what did I miss? Like, what is happening? What is running through this country that I didn't know enough about? Like, I thought I knew, but I didn't know enough about. And so that, I think, definitely compelled research. And I think that was happening. I mean, that was a time when there were so many sort of like syllabi, like syllabi on settler colonialism, syllabi on Black Lives Matter, syllabi on, all of these things that were circulating in academic circles all over the internet, in the sense of like, we all need to know, this urge to know more, to research more. And I have noticed that like a lot of nonfiction books that are engaging history start with, it was the summer of 2016, or it was the fall of 2016. So many of books really kind of came out of that moment, I think, for similar reasons.
Yeah. I want to ask about, there's a great question in the Q&A, and we'll get to that first, but I want to ask about the archive itself.
Sure.
Like what are in the archives? I mean, we've seen some of the photos, some of the elements, some of the writings, but can you tell us a little bit more about what was there that you had access to?
So as I said, there was 11 volumes. They're bound. They're typed. He hand typed them even when he had like severe arthritis. He still managed to do that. And where it's amazing to look at just the materiality of it. I mean, where there's a correction, they literally, pieces cut out or something is glued on top, that kind of thing. And the first 2 volumes are really autobiography. They're really telling his, from his point of view, his life story. They also include extremely long poems. He was a very, very enthusiastic poet, and he wrote in ballad meter almost entirely, and sometimes in a kind of like dialect of sort of Indiana farm boy. So those are fantastic, and they're rhyming, and they're impressive. Very different than the way I write poetry, but and then after the first 2 volumes, it shifts to really mostly letters. So he was a really, prolific letter writer, as people were back then. So he would send the letter, but he would also make a copy of the letter for the archive, and then letters that he received, he would type up. And so there's long back and forths between the children as they grow up, between other family members, between other politicians and friends. So that's a big part of the archive, which is really, really interesting. Because then you get other voices, not just his, all of these other voices, and debates. He had a huge debate for many, many, many years with his oldest and best friend, where he was advocating for eugenics, and his friend had become a socialist and was advocating for socialism. And they were having what basically turns into the sort of nature culture debate, played out in these painful at times and loving also, and sometimes very funny letters back and forth that just go on. And I write a lot about that exchange because I found it to be very beautiful in ways, and also sort of tragic. And then besides the letters, there's some photographs. He definitely pasted in some photos of the family. And then there's letters. The other big part is letters to the editor. So he was a public and political person. And even after he wasn't a congressman, that was the 3, so it's the 6 years, and then he was done with that. And he had a one session with the Colorado State House, but that was sort of just a dip. And other than that, he was then not in the public, he's not a politician anymore. but he was still really involved in thinking about, the state of the world, the state of politics. And so he made his opinions known through lots and lots of letters to newspapers.
So interesting.
Yeah.
We're at the top of the hour almost, but
Okay.
we definitely want to talk about the politics part, because there's this great question in the Q&A about asking you to maybe tell us more about the connections between the political movements, populism and spiritualist beliefs. And then, of course, how eugenics kind of fits into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do
Sure.
they all kind of interact and
Yeah.
play off each other?
Well, some of it I'll say kind of applies in this case, right? Because there's, as I said, there's different populisms, there's different populisms around the world as well. And there's different spiritualisms. There's lots of different practices of spiritualism. But one thing that definitely does connect these two movements is what I allude to briefly in the talk, is that they're both really anti-hierarchical movements. They're seeking to break down hierarchical barriers. And so in the case of spiritualism, one of the main, points of resistance there is Christianity. So for the spiritualists in general, and of course there were also Christian spiritualists, but in general, they were anti sort of Christian, and instead, or at least they were not Christians, and instead they took spiritualism as a kind of religion, even though they thought of it as not as a religion, but as a science. They were also, there was a whole gender kind of rebalancing that happens through spiritualism, because many of the media were young women, and they got to speak publicly and often make their political beliefs known through the process of speaking as someone else, right? So that's a really, really interesting thing that has been studied quite a bit. And the spiritualists tended to be, kind of political radicals. They tended to be abolitionists. They were in favor of Indian reform, and that, of course, at that time really meant assimilation. But nonetheless, they were the people that were often speaking out for Indian reform, such as they understood it. And they were often against child labor. They had political beliefs that align very much with the populist political beliefs. And this is not to say that all the populists were spiritualists or all the spiritualists were populists. In fact, spiritualism kind of starts earlier than populism by like 40 years or 30 years. So but it continues, it kind of has waves. And it's continuing today, as is populism. So there's a kind of political alignment between the two groups. And I think the reason for that is that both sort of work against sort of expertise or established authorities to sort of come up from underneath to kind of break things open in really interesting and different ways. So with the eugenics, so again, it's not something I would say about all, that all populists became eugenics, eugenicists, not at all. But there is this way in which I see the chats and then I'm like, oh, I get distracted. There is this way that, so a really interesting aspect of spiritualism is, which Omer definitely believed, is that the spirits after death, the spirits don't just become static, floating around ghosts or whatever, or voice, whatever it is. They continue to evolve. So the spiritualists actually believe in the concept of evolution. They believe in the development of the human. And so as the spirit just keeps becoming more and more, perfected. So this idea of the sort of perfectibility of the human is kind of already there in spiritualism. And of course, that's the idea of eugenics. It is a violence, and it is ultimately absolutely racist in how it plays out, even if in America it's not named as such, like it is in Germany. Nonetheless, it's based on this idea of progress, right? So I think it's important we say that, because a lot of ideas of progress are in fact fascist or violent.
Hmm.
And so the idea, was that if we just sort of manipulate the genetic pool through, forced sterilization, through immigration control, through the isolation of certain kinds of people so that they cannot breed, then eventually the gene pool will get better and better and better, or purer and purer and purer, and the human race will evolve. So these two, spiritualism, eugenics, they do share those things.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's a lot more to say about spiritualism and how white spiritualism works with race, and in this case, it's Native Americans that he's sort of engaging, and I put that in really big scare quotes, through his beliefs, but his spiritualist beliefs. But I think that's a longer and more complicated story than we kind of have time to tell.
Yeah.
So you gotta read the book for that one.
Kind of another question about these political movements. Were they formally like aligned with each other, and did they coordinate in tactics on
Oh,
certain things? And what were their tactics? Like, if someone asks, like, how did they mobilize? Right? What
which,
were these letter? Any of them? You can talk
oh,
about any of them. Were
sure.
they letter writing? Were
Okay.
they, that kind
Oh,
of
well, this
convening?
like, no, I don't. It's a great question, and I don't think I have enough evidence to talk about a kind of, you know, working together. I mean, other than to say that, Omer Kem became a populist because of spiritualism. Like he met spiritualists or
Right.
no, the other way around, sorry, he became a spiritualist because of populism. As he was campaigning as a populist, he met spiritualists, and they sort of
Hmm.
taught him about spiritualism. But then also, really interestingly, once he was a congressman in D.C., he was befriended by a couple, the Brands, the Blands, sorry, and they were spiritualists. They had a niece who was a medium. They befriended him explicitly in order to lobby him on the behalf of Native American sovereignty, which was their
Hmm.
cause. And their way of getting sort of in his head essentially was through inviting him to come to the house and experience meetings with his dead relatives, and especially a dead child, his son. So in that case, the spiritualists, I think it's very obvious that they were using spiritualism as a political tool to influence politics.
Hmm.
So that definitely happens, and it happens, I'm sure, in other cases. That's the case that I know of. But also, as I mentioned, the spiritualists would often speak in the voice, like, so, say a young woman would speak through a native spirit, and in speaking through that native spirit, she would speak of the sort of plight or the suffering of Native people. So they would use the medium in order to make a case, either for abolition early on or for Native rights later. I don't want to give them too much, like, I don't want to paint them as heroes, because there's also a really strange kind of, appropriation, racial appropriation, and sort
Yeah.
of imaginary that's going on there that is troubling and that is interesting and that plays out in contemporary life in lots of ways that are very interesting to
Mm.
think about. And I write about that. But that does happen. As far as strategies for the populists or the eugenicists, I mean, it was law. That was their strategy. I mean, the populists got involved in politics. I mean, at first they were more like a sort of mutual aid club, the
Mm.
farmers' alliances. And then as they realized that the changes that they wanted weren't going to come just through helping each other, that they needed to enact changes in law, they got involved as politicians. But eugenics also was enacted through law. I mean, there was practice of forced sterilization before it was legal, and that's important to know about. But you know, mostly it was a debate that happened in state houses all over the country, and then was as far as the forced sterilization part, that's something that was happening in institutions, in institutions. Yeah.
So I have to ask the question about the video, the film, and
Yeah.
how
Let's talk
that
about it.
came about, and like how did that happen? That's just
Uh,
so interesting.
isn't it beautiful?
Yeah.
It's because I just am so lucky to have such brilliant friends. The video, so Carolina Ebeid is also a poet, a fantastic poet, and has been working with video in this sort of collage style for
Mm.
quite a while. You can find her on Instagram. I highly recommend. And her she's made other videos of that accompany her own poems and other poets' poems, but this was obviously a little bit different. The musician, I'll just full disclosure, is my son. Yeah, Ben. And so what we first did was, Caroline and I wanted to collaborate together. We'd been talking about it. And then, when the book came out, I was like, why don't we do something for this? So she said, just send me everything you've got, like all the video, all the photos, all the, everything you have, send me everything. So I just, photo dumped her, tons and tons of stuff. And then I just said, do whatever you want, and she just played and played. And eventually she made a version of it, which was close to what you saw, but different. And we played it at the opening, the launch for the book. And Benjamin showed up and improvised on his cello to the film. So that was the first rendition. After that, we decided to make it into a thing that could travel. And so that meant, she revised it. We talked together. We thought through how to revise it so that it would work with a certain kind of reading. And then he actually composed the music that you heard. So that was a much more deliberate and longer process.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to look him up, but I just put Carolina Ebeid's information in the
Oh,
chat
awesome.
for people, so people can check that out. I thought that
Yeah.
was so, I mean, the film was so moving, and I think
Hmm.
everything about this presentation was really thought-provoking,
Yeah.
and there's lots for us to unpack. I feel more settled now talking to you more
Oh,
about
okay.
about everything.
I don't know
I
if
was
that's
like,
good
oh
or
my God.
bad.
Yeah, a little, maybe
Yeah.
it's a little bit of both, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But we are, and again, I'll send you, and I put the how to get the book up in the chat again. I just put it up there so people can find that. If they're interested in
Yeah.
getting the book, you should
Hmm.
definitely check it out. But it's about 6:10 here. I know
Okay.
you're a little
A
further
little
ahead
later.
of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna wrap up here, and I'm
Okay.
gonna
Yeah.
wrap up by first saying thank you so much for this presentation. It was really terrific to have you and to share your work with the book club audience. So
Well,
thank you for
thank you
that.
so much. I'm very grateful, and thanks to everyone who's still on. And I'm easy to find if you have other questions. I'm just easy to find. You can find me and ask me a question over email or whatever. So yeah, take care and thank you, Kevin.
Right. So again, thank you. And thank you everyone out there for joining us for this Book Club of California program tonight. Our next program is in a couple of weeks. It's actually Monday, May 6th is going to be our next program. It's our annual Oscar Lewis Awards ceremony. That will be a hybrid program with a virtual audience on Zoom and an in-person audience here at the book club in San Francisco. And everyone who's attending tonight should receive an email announcement. Book club members will receive a printed announcement of this year's recipients for achievement in both Western history and the book arts. So that's the annual Oscar Lewis Award ceremony on Monday, May 6th at 6 p.m. On Zoom and live in person here at the book club. So you can register for that program or any book club program online at bccbooks.org/programs, or you can use the link in the weekly programs emails that you're probably receiving from the Book Club of California and how you found out about tonight's program. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to having you at another book club program in the future. Good night, everyone.